Now, I want to move on back to the election because all eyes are going to be on Anthony Albanese over the coming weeks, with speculation again mounting about when we're going to wind up going to the polls. Now, as I mentioned, I think sooner than later, but maybe he wants to milk this for as long as he can. For more on this, I'm joined by Redbridge Group Director Kos Samaras. Kos, thank you so much for coming on Credlin this evening. Really appreciate it. We've seen Anthony Albanese and Jim Chalmers in Gympie today kicking off a tour of Queensland and WA and talking up the tagline, Building Australia's Future. What does this tell you about their campaign strategy, Kos? And more to the point, do you think that they are hitting the concerns where Australians are actually worried about things and the things that are going to drive their decision when it comes to polling day?
You could see they've done their research. So building a better future for Australia, it's effectively what we see right across the country when we talk to voters in every state, and that is that there's a significant hunger out there within the electorate to see our political leaders actually embrace policy that is going to build the country and future-proof it against what a lot of voters think are some pretty serious headwinds. The problem for the Albanese government is that they've spent 2.5 years not doing that. So the pitch is right, but they're carrying a lot of baggage, and that baggage might actually make it very hard for them to sell it successfully in the next, say, 14 weeks.
Yeah, I mean, John Howard always had the phrase, you can't fatten a pig on market day about these things. And, does that apply here? Did they waste a year with The Voice before getting on to the business of the Australian people? Are we seeing some of that factor in here?
There's no doubt about that. I think that referendum, when we look back at the first term of this government, whether they are re-elected or not, that referendum has definitely inflicted some pretty severe political wounds to this government. It was run during a time where I would say that the inflationary crisis was at its peak in terms of wreaking its damage on our suburban and regional voters. And as a result, it's given off a very strong impression that the Albanese government's priorities are all in the wrong places. Yeah, that's a very hard brain to shake.
And you've done some fascinating research just about where voters are sitting, in various seats here and their alignment with their incumbent parties. Tell us what you found in New South Wales, and I've found some of this particularly surprising in Victoria. There's some surprising good news for the coalition in some of these places.
Yeah, look, I would say the ideological heartbeat of the country is centre-right.
Yeah.
So we asked voters, from 0 to 10, 0 being very left-wing, 10 being very right-wing, where do you sit in terms of your beliefs? And most Australians sit somewhere in the centre to the centre-right. There are people on the left side, but the majority of seats that Labor holds are centre to centre-right. And the majority of voters perceive the Labor Party as the party that neatly sits in that space. But it's not transferring to support for them on the ground. So of the 76 seats which neatly fall into that basket, 44, for example, are centre to centre right that are currently held by the Labor Party. So it's perhaps a warning for them that they probably need to really be careful about what they do on what we will define as socially progressive side of things going forward, because that's not where the country is.
Yeah, but then at the same time, how would you rate how Peter Dutton is going, meeting the market? We haven't seen a huge number of policies out of them. We've got nuclear, obviously, but Peter Dutton is running a very sort of deliberate, I think, campaign on this. But do voters, are they starting to feel like they've got a case to switch their allegiance if they voted for Labor the last time? Is that change, that global change mandate that seems to be sweeping through certainly the English-speaking democratic world and Europe as well? Yeah. Is that still active here in what you're seeing in Australia?
The last MRP that we did, which was breaking down every federal electorate in the country in terms of where we think that that federal electorate will land. For the first time, we started to see evidence that outer suburban voters who have historically been voting for Labor are moving directly over to the coalition. Not in huge numbers, but enough to put seats like Werriwa and Macarthur out of Western Sydney on the block. Seats like Hawke and Holt and Isaacs and McEwen in Victoria on the block. these sort of seats that we're talking about, like Holt, for example, I mean, it was historically always been considered a safe Labor seat. So there is evidence that this phenomenon is occurring. Now, the question is, can he transfer it to actually moving these seats over to his pile? Because there's so many seats now in these two big states of New South Wales and Victoria that are just up for grabs, but it's unclear who's going to grab them.
Finally, Cos, I want to ask you about gender, because this is something that played out very heavily in the recent election in the United States. How much are you seeing? I know there was some analysis from JWS recently on this, certainly, but what are you seeing in your numbers, in your focus groups about the gender issue? Have women moved further to the left in Australia than men? Have men moved to the right, like we saw in the United States, certainly? Is this a phenomenon that both parties have to grapple with, this gender divide? And how do you wind up pitching a message that can get both genders on board if they aren't even talking to each other politically?
Yeah, there's a bit of nuance here. So if we're talking about women in the outer suburbs and regions, their most pressing priority right now is the cost of living crisis. And we find those women are not really transfixed on the sort of social issues that I would say the left is preoccupied with. Professional women in the inner parts of our large cities, particularly in those sort of electorates which the Teals won, yep, absolutely. They are moving to the left, and they're going to be a significant problem for the coalition going forward. But again, so it's about that geographic nuance is important. The same applies to men. If we go to young men in the inner parts of our large cities, progressive. Young men in the outer suburbs and regions, they're more likely to vote for someone like Trump, but they just don't have someone like Trump available for them to choose from. So they're kind of like floating out there in the ether, not knowing what to do with their vote. So there's a lot of, fragmentation going on, even amongst the genders.
Fascinating stuff, Cos. I'll tell you, the other week I put on a MAGA hat and wore it to an inner city shopping center as an experiment. It was the young men who gave me the most thumbs up. So that was an interesting sort of bit on that gender divide there. Cos Samaras, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.